Lecture 6, the literature review. In the course of doing research, any researcher always returns and draws on previous available knowledge to inform any new study through the literature review. We have seen in previous lectures that the literature review is one of the major stages of any study. We can't do research without reviewing the literature. By doing a literature review, the researcher will achieve accumulation of research, because the literature review helps them to justify their works and link them to existing knowledge. The literature review permits the researchers firstly to contextualize their studies, and on the other hand, it helps them to develop appropriate methodologies and tools for their new studies. In this lecture, we'll try to understand what the review in the literature means, how can this be exploited by the researcher, and how is it done. Talking about a literature review is very wide-ranging, and there are many books which are written about it. Here we have selected some of the main points which can help you to do your own research. We'll firstly define the literature review, and we'll have a look at its function. Additionally, we'll see the way it is structured, or its content, and the depth according to which we can view the literature. And also we'll learn about how to arrange a literature review, and also how to do it step by step. What is a literature review? Generally, we look at the review of literature as a stage, an essential stage of research, which informs any new study. If we analyze the phrase itself, we'll see that it contains two parts: literature and review. The term literature includes all the existing research and theory about a given area at both the theoretical and the practical levels. So it involves both the theory, the concepts, and also the studies which were conducted in a given area. The second part of the phrase is the term review. It refers to an activity that is done by the researcher. It is the activity of examining first and arranging, organizing the accumulated knowledge in a way that shows how research is interconnected, how the lines of research are interconnected, the relationships between research, and how the new study would be considered a development of the existing research. Reviewing the literature is not only a matter of repeating what the others have said. It requires inventiveness or creativity on the part of the researcher. It is a very demanding activity, and because it centrally synthesizes. The researcher will synthesize. He will not only repeat what the others have said or list what the others have said. Synthesis involves, for example, showing similarities, showing differences. Also, it includes showing the relationships. If there are any relationships between studies, these should be discovered by the researcher. We mean here that the superficial gathering of information or listing of information can never act as a real review of literature. When reviewing the literature, the researcher will not only read for the sake of reading or compile for the sake of compiling, but the purpose is to identify issues which have not been sufficiently examined or researched before, and then logically prepares for a new investigation of these issues. In this way, the new research will add to or complete previous research. When we say it completes it, we mean that it fills in its gaps. The third thing that we can say about the review of literature is that it can be seen as a process or as a product. And this sometimes confuses the novice researchers. When we look at it as a process, it refers to an activity that is performed by the researcher. And when we look at it as a product, it refers to a text that is written by the researcher after doing or performing the activity. Here, the process of reviewing the literature is a systematic or a step-by-step procedure where the researchers spot or find and then critically examine the documents that contain any information linked to a research problem. So this is an activity, in fact. When we take it as a product, here it refers to a section, for instance, of a dissertation, or a section of a journal article which is titled The Review of Literature. We may find it in doctoral theses, master theses, and so on. Here the researchers will report what they have read and analyzed. They will tell the readers about their activity. So when we take the review of literature as a product, its length varies according to the work which is being done. If it is a matter of writing a journal article, here the review of literature may range between 1 page or 2 pages or more. But in the case of dissertations, it may range up to 100 or 200 pages, especially a master dissertation. Here we have a lot of chapters in which the researcher reviews the literature. In the case of doctoral theses, here the size of the review of literature will be larger. In any study, researchers both practice this process, read, compile, analyze, synthesize, and then they produce a written product. We understand from this definition of the review of literature that reviewing the literature is not the whole work, it's not the whole study, but it is a preparatory stage for a study. It is the stage where the researcher goes back to the existing knowledge and tries to find a place there to start his new project. This is the theoretical part. The literature review concerns the theoretical part. It represents a foundation of a new study. The review of literature enables the researcher to contextualize any study. But this is not the only function of this section of research. It has a number of other functions. In the first place, the review of literature helps the researchers draw connections in existing knowledge. When a researcher reads about a topic or a subject, he may discover theories, he may discover concepts or methodologies. Here, the task of the researcher is to find connections between the points that are discovered. Also, the researcher will, in addition to making the connections, he will try to find a place somewhere within these theories and methodologies. It is like finding one's place on a map. In addition to that, the review of literature can lead researchers to engage in a written dialogue with other researchers in the same field. How does this dialogue happen? This is when we learn about the views of the others, and when we present the views of the others, it's like conversing with these researchers, with the other researchers. showing contrasts, showing differences, opposing the other's views, presenting the other views, constitutes a kind of dialogue. Although people are not together, are not face to face, but this can be taken as a dialogue as long as it involves opinions and presentation of these opinions. Here the researcher tries to understand and at the same time to respond to the other's contributions. Thirdly, the review of literature constitutes a part of the study where researchers justify their choices of topics and their choices of methodologies. The choice of topic is not random, and the choice of methodology also is not random. When we present the existing methodologies and when we try to adopt some of them or to follow some topics, some lines of research about certain topics, here this provides a kind of justification of our choices. Because research does not start from scratch. Further, the review of literature can be considered the source of new research problems in areas where lacunae have been pinpointed. Sometimes we draw on the review of literature in order to find the research problem itself. Here we can differentiate between two types of reviewing the literature. We have the initial review of literature before identifying the research problem, and we may have the profound review of literature after identifying the research problem. The researcher seeks to find more about the area. This is a very important function of a review of literature. It helps, in some cases, it helps us to find the research problems themselves. It serves as a source of the research problem. On the basis of what we have said, we can conclude that the review of literature acts as a driving force and a jumping off point within research. Another side which relates to the benefits of reviewing the literature is about what the researcher gets from the review of literature, or the skills of the researcher himself. The activity of reviewing the literature helps in demonstrating the skills of the researcher and his perception of the major themes in their fields. At the same time, it helps the researcher to develop his skills. The review of literature also reveals the controversies and the gaps and the conflicts, and it helps in informing the new study. The review of literature serves as a learning tool about one's area of investigation. After conducting your review of literature, you will learn a lot about the area of investigation. Usually, when dissertations are evaluated or theses, the review of literature is evaluated alone. After reading a student's review of literature, we can learn about the degree to which they have read and the degree to which they have understood and comprehended the existing literature, the literature that they have consulted. Also, the evaluator will discover a lot about the researcher's abilities of writing, of synthesis and analysis. Writing a good review of literature is one of the strong points of the researcher, but it's not all. The researcher needs to do more than reviewing the literature in most of the disciplines. Given these multiple functions of reviewing the literature, it is important for any new student or a novice researcher to know how to review the literature. And this is, of course, a learnable activity. We come now to discuss the content and the depth of the review of literature. What does the review of literature contain? And how much information is needed? In general, the review of literature should contain two things. Firstly, the main results of previous studies reported on. And the second thing is some theoretical backgrounding to the new study, discussion of theories, discussion of concepts, definitions, and so on. We should emphasize that the review of literature contains relevant material. Focus should be put on the studies which are of direct relevance to one's research. And in addition to mentioning the studies, the researcher should provide a critical comment on them, on their findings and their methodologies. This would enable the researcher to talk about how the new study is related to the gaps in the findings of previous studies. This is in fact a central point in reviewing the literature, which is sometimes disregarded by some novice researchers. Sometimes novice researchers try to write everything that is directly or indirectly related to the topic. Sometimes the review of literature starts with elements which are very far from one's study, and this would be considered a mistake. If all researchers follow this practice of writing about things which are directly or indirectly related to their research, the researchers will fall in the problem of reiterating previous reviews. That's why it is emphasized that the review should include direct and relevant, the most relevant material. Here we have a problem whether a researcher should write a very deep or profound review of literature or just a superficial one. This is partly related to the level of research, whether it is a bachelor's research, a master research, or a doctoral research. This is what you can see in the first diagram. At bachelor level, the review is usually descriptive and not very analytical, and it is short. In master's studies, it is somehow longer, more analytical, and summative. At PhD level, the review is analytical, synthetic, so it analyzes and combines at the same time. It is comprehensive, it includes so many parts, and it is lengthy. We conclude that doctoral research, reviews in doctoral research are more profound than the other levels. On the whole, we can say that the higher the level of study, the more depth and breadth is expected in the review of literature. Doctoral reviews usually provide a state-of-the-art picture of existing research. This means that the doctoral researcher will tell the reader about what's happening up to that point in research. Therefore, it is expected in very deep reviews of literature that the researcher talks about the very recent studies. One of the criteria of evaluating a review of literature is whether the researcher has tackled recent studies or not. Novice researchers usually have problems when reviewing the literature because they are confused whether they have to write an all-encompassing, a very large and a very comprehensive review of literature, which includes even irrelevant material or basic definitions and basics of the area, or they would provide or write a narrowed review which focuses on the research that is directly linked to a particular study they have at hand. In fact, this is a cultural matter. Also, it is related to one's discipline. In more technical disciplines or hard sciences, the reviews are very direct, while in humanities, the tendency is to opt for broadening the scope of the review. So the scope of the review of literature is debatable. Here we can distinguish two ways of delineating the scope of the review of literature. The researcher may produce comprehensive reviews or selective reviews, and this is what is seen in the second diagram. So comprehensive reviews, in this type of reviews, the researcher includes all the literature related to one study. So this is the study, and here we see the scope of the literature. It is very large and it is very comprehensive. So this will appear in the form of a lengthy, a very long and comprehensive account which contains every aspect of the topic under examination. As I said before, this is a common practice in the social sciences. While this kind of reviews does provide a good contextualization of the study, it helps the reader to see where the study is exactly in relation to theories and concepts and so on. These reviews do not necessarily lead the readers to easily find the relationship between previous research and the new inquiry. Here the reader will be somehow lost in finding the place of the study in relation to the previous knowledge. The selective review, which you see on the right, requires that researchers read thoroughly all the available literature. However, their literature review will be somewhat selective. They will not write everything. The researcher reports only the gist of what they have consulted, the most important, the most directly related material. The researcher attempts to highlight the recent studies and to discuss their findings in order to set up a good context for the new piece of research. This is typical of hard sciences. That's why, theses in hard sciences are shorter than theses in the soft sciences. At the end, we should emphasize that when writing the review of literature, the researcher will should be very selective in fixing the scope of the review by taking only the most directly related material. Another aspect of the review of literature which usually confuses novice researchers is the way it is to be organized, or how to arrange the review of literature. Here many options exist, and we should say that these options that will be discussed can be used together in the same work. The first option is a chronological arrangement. And of course, this depends on the needs of the researcher. This method is used when the researcher's aim is to trace the development of a topic historically. For example, a survey of language teaching methods over time. We should mention here that when the researcher opts for a chronological arrangement, this is not it is not an obligation that the researcher would arrange all the review of literature chronologically, but he can just use this method in one of its sections. The second possible arrangement of review of literature is a theme-based arrangement. In this case, the researcher classifies or categorizes and then describes the surveyed studies. For instance, a researcher compiles like 20 studies, and through reading about the tendencies of these studies, he finds that it is possible to group them into 3 major lines of research. So these can be considered as themes. The researcher here should be capable of finding the themes. It depends largely on the creativity or the ability to synthesize that the researcher possesses. For example, when reviewing the literature about language teaching methods, the methods can be presented according to their focus. Learner-centered methods, learning-centered methods, or teacher-centered methods, and not necessarily according to their chronology. The third option of organizing the review of literature is according to the research questions. So it is research questions based arrangement. And here this depends on the complexity of the study and the number of research questions, of course. In this case, the researcher is guided by the research questions of the new study, and he focuses on the theory and research which are linked to each question. So the division of the review of literature will be related to the number of questions. One part about the first question and one part about the second question. The fourth option is variables or variable-based arrangement. And this is very common in the master dissertations. This method is based on the key variables of the study. Each variable is reviewed separately, sometimes in separate chapters. For example, if the study is about the effect of language transfer on learning English prepositions, the researcher will firstly discuss sufficiently the first variable, which is language transfer, all the theory which is related to language transfer and maybe the studies, and then in one chapter, and then in the second chapter he will talk about the second variable, English prepositions. He will describe what he finds in books of grammar about English prepositions and the studies which were conducted on English prepositions, and if possible, the studies which were previously conducted on the effect of language transfer on English prepositions and their findings. The next possible way of arranging the review of literature is points of view arrangement. Some studies involve controversial issues, debatable issues, which require the presentation of the literature according to the detected opinions or the perspectives. Suppose that the issue contains two opposing opinions. So in the first section of the review of literature, the researcher will present or report everything related to the first view, their arguments, their evidence, and so on. In the second section, the second view will be presented and discussed. The next option is to be eclectic, or a combination of arrangements. Here, depending on the aims of the objectives of the researcher and the type of study, the researcher may opt for more than one of the above-mentioned methods of structuring the review of literature. For instance, he may opt for a variables-based arrangement, Chapter 1, Variable 1, Chapter 2, Variable 2, and within Chapter 1 there is a chronological arrangement, and in the second one there is a points of view arrangement. This is only an example. We emphasize at the end that the researcher has total freedom in organizing the review of literature, but this should not deviate from the goal of the study itself or the objectives of the study. The easiest and the best method is to consider the research problem and to look for the best way to inform the reader sufficiently, both at the theoretical level and the practical level. The review of literature can be considered a process, as we said previously. If we perform this process systematically, the researcher will be able to provide the reader with an exact image of the theory that surrounds the study, and hence he succeeds in contextualizing the study adequately. There are steps of reviewing the literature. The first step is searching for sources, collecting the sources. The second step is the critical reading of the sources. The third step is synthesizing the sources. The fourth step is preparing to write. And the final step is writing the review of literature. The first step of reviewing the literature is searching for sources. This doesn't involve only the collection of the sources, but also their evaluation. This is seen as the most demanding experience in the literature review. Centrally, the researcher will collect or compile the sources and also will evaluate them. The focus will be on their type, whether they are primary or secondary, also on their relevance, the sources which are relevant to the study. Another point which helps in selecting the sources is the author. The focus should be placed on the renowned authors most of the time, as well as the aim of each source. The content also matters, and the currency, whether the source is new or old. Where can we find the sources? Usually the library and the internet are the most common places where to locate literature. Sometimes instructors can provide you with relevant materials or resources, and in other cases, the librarians, especially those who are specialized, can suggest some resources to any researcher. We talked about the type of sources. Here we can distinguish two important types: primary sources and secondary sources. The primary sources are the original sources of information. Examples of primary sources include, for instance, novels. If you are interested in studying a novel, so the novel itself is a primary source. A speech, in the case of discourse analysis. Eyewitness accounts, letters, and results of original research. The secondary resources are the writings about the primary sources. So they compile or interpret the primary sources. This can involve, for instance, an analysis of a novel, or an analysis of a poem, or a report on a presidential speech. In that case, the researcher will not consult the source directly, but he will consult another researcher who has dealt with the same source. Secondary sources can also include a review of scientific findings. So instead of dealing with the findings yourself, you will resort to someone who has consulted the topic and collected the findings. A good researcher should not depend heavily on secondary resources, but should consult the primary ones. Sometimes the secondary resources are helpful because they guide the researcher, but in other cases they restrict the perspectives of research and they reduce originality. A central question sometimes or most of the time arises for new researchers who are dealing with topics from a fresh angle. It is, how can I find the sources? Or what is my starting point? A very practical way which helps in situating the needed materials is by consulting the tables of contents in journals or reference lists in articles and books. Or sometimes we refer to the reference itself. The first research will be topical. You will look for information about a topic. Once you detect an article, for instance, that deals with the topic, you will go to the reference list and see the bibliography which is included. This will provide you with lines that you can follow, and this will direct you to other useful resources. This is the most practical way to start research about relevant literature. There are many categories of sources. These include academic journals. We mean here the articles which are published in the academic journals. The articles can be theoretical or empirical. Theoretical articles are often called conceptual articles. They deal with concepts, with theories. but they do not include a practical part. The empirical articles are in fact studies, whole studies, with their own review of literature and their specific findings. Another category is the books. A book can be written by one author, an expert in the field, and sometimes books appear in the form of edited books. That is to say, they have an editor and a collection of chapters. Each chapter is written by a distinct author or authors. Usually edited books have a theme to which all the chapters are related. Another source is textbooks and handbooks. In addition to these, the researcher can find information in sponsored websites. These are sponsored by institutions or organizations. It is important that the researcher should avoid the personal websites. Interviews also can serve researchers, especially those which are conducted with experts, encyclopedias, newspapers and magazines, and especially those which have an academic merit. Not any newspaper or magazine is worth considering. Sometimes individual websites, but we have to focus on the reliability of websites. After collecting the sources, the researcher moves on to the critical reading of these materials. It is important to say here that the steps may overlap. This means that the researcher can start reading critically while compiling new sources. Critical reading is a key stage. In this stage, the researcher treats the collected sources. He dips in a focused, analytical, and critical type of reading. Because of the multitude of sources and sometimes the large number, some think that this stage is extremely difficult and circular. The researcher sometimes finds himself turning in the same circle. They may spend weeks or even months reading without being able to grasp or use information they find adequately. To overcome this obstacle, the researcher should select only what directly helps in comprehending the research topic, and they should discard the irrelevant material. In this stage, the researcher will centrally practice some other activities like note-taking while reading, highlighting the most important information. Sometimes when there are a lot of details about a point, the researcher needs to practice summarizing. And these techniques can help in information gathering and understanding. The aim of the researcher in this stage is to understand the topic as much as possible. Sometimes researchers commit some errors when conducting or when reading critically. One major mistake or error is reading without recording the bibliographical information of the source which is consulted. If, for instance, a researcher finds an interesting chapter in a book and reads and collects the information from this chapter without recording all the information about the book itself, he may arrive at a point where he loses the bibliographical information and cannot find the book again. So the sources of information are sometimes forgotten, or it may be very hard, if not impossible, to find them again. A good tip is to write all the bibliographical information on the first page of any document that you are using. Another major aspect of critical reading is knowing how to read, or the skills of reading. Each type of source is different from the other types and requires a different way of reading it. When we read a book, this would be different from when we read a research article. In other words, the parts or the sections of these resources that should be consulted are not the same. When reading a book, for instance, the researcher will focus or have a look at the table of contents, the book jacket, if there is any, the forward section, which appears at the beginning, or the preface, the introduction of the book, because these introductory sections usually say something about the organization of the book, the goal of the book. They provide brief information. Another section of the book which is very helpful is the index. Either a topic index or an author index. This is to be found at the end of the book, and this will direct you to go straightforwardly to the page that on which you will find the topic. But when the researcher uses a journal article, the focus will be different. The first element that should be considered is the title. Also the abstract. The abstract summarizes the whole article, and sometimes we don't need to read the whole article and we just restrict the reading to the abstract. The opening paragraphs as well, because they give information about the structure of the article. The topic sentences of the paragraphs. Topic sentences tell about the content of paragraphs. And also the closing paragraphs, the conclusion and the closing paragraphs in general. These sections contain the gist of the article. Because researchers are usually pressed by time and in front of a huge amount of sources, it's not possible to read every word or everything in a reference. Critical reading requires proficiency in skimming or quick reading, reading that focuses on the main parts, like topic sentences, theses, statements, and so on, and sometimes scanning when looking for particular information like definitions. An important skill, additional skill, in this stage is note-taking. Notes are very important. While reading, the researcher should take notes. The notes can appear in the form of quotations, they can appear in the form of paraphrasing, and sometimes we have summary notes. One way to keep an organized record of one's reading is to use bibliography cards, although this system is somehow old. A bibliography card is a card which has two sides. On the front side, the researcher will write all the bibliographical information about the reference or the source, like the title of the book if it is a book, the title of the article if it is an article, or a title of a chapter, the page numbers, the publication year, the edition, the publisher, and the place of publication, depending on the type, of course. On the other side, the researcher will write the information that he has found in the form of a quotation, a paraphrase, or a summary. The researcher can use cards of different colors depending on the chapters of his work. Because the cards are mobile, it is possible to reorder them, to place them on a table and to see the connections between them, and to group them according to categories. This will help the researcher later on to write an outline. Using these cards, it will be possible for the researcher to manage information very easily because they are visual. The third stage is synthesizing the sources. What do we mean by a synthesis? Synthesis means the organization or the grouping of information. Reviewing a literature is not just a matter of gathering information and listing information in the form of a chain which is not logically interconnected. A major problem in which researchers can sometimes fall in is to produce a superficial chain of detached pieces of information which lacks direction. If, for instance, a researcher is surveying theories on a given subject, A good review of literature is not only a listing of the theories, but it's a discussion of how the theories are related to each other, how they are similar to each other or different from each other. This should be explicitly said by the researcher while reviewing the literature. Here we have the author's voices and we have the researcher's voice. The process of synthesis entails creating a scheme in which everything is brought together, combined, contrasted, and integrated according to its content. This requires very special skills on the part of the researcher. Let's take an example. Suppose that the researcher is trying to define a concept or to look for definitions provided by others about a given concept. After reading, he may compile, say, 4 or 5 definitions. What is the role of the researcher? The researcher, for example, may show explicitly and say that 2 authors use the same definition or have the same orientation in their definition of a concept, or that they differ in the way they see it. Researchers can also demonstrate where studies converge or where they diverge when measuring or classifying the variables and so on. Some researchers are good at synthesizing while others are not, and this makes the difference between researchers. When synthesizing these resources, the researcher needs to sort out, to organize, this is the key word here, the literature by following a variety of standards that they see relevant. For example, they can organize by theory, theory 1, theory 2, theory 3, or by variable. They can organize by method or by population. A good technique is to present the scheme that shows the synthesis in the form of a table. The table is an excellent way of summarizing the points and showing the relationships between them. Synthesis is a good indicator of the researcher's ability to reconstruct. It means to build again in clear patterns the scattered knowledge they find. Usually the knowledge that exists in the literature is scattered. It goes in different directions, but the skill of the researcher will help in building an edifice of knowledge which is related to a certain study, which is relevant to a certain study. The synthesis stage produces a preliminary image about the strengths, the weaknesses, and also the interrelationships in previous research. The 4th stage of reviewing the literature is preparing to write. This is essentially a planning stage. It is in fact based on the previous stage. In this stage, the researcher will produce an outline. This is usually only a preliminary outline or a working plan. This means that it is not final. This is the first way that the researcher suggests to organize the literature, but it may change later. In the course of further reading, the arrangement of the literature review or its outline can be improved. This is done by making additions, restructuring, reorganization, and sometimes deletion, according to the new details and researcher needs. According to new resources that the researcher may find, he may add sections or headings or elements. He may think that some elements are irrelevant and can delete them. He may find a better way of structuring the information. This depends on further reading. In the pre-writing stage, the scope of the literature review is still incomplete, and in fact it is never complete. The researcher may continue reviewing the literature or writing or improving the review of literature even after practicing or the practical, finalizing the practical part. I mean here after collecting data and analyzing it. But in the pre-writing stage, the researcher now has at least a partial picture about what to include in their report. We insist that the researcher will continue improving the literature review and its organization, but he should not do this excessively. I mean here that the researcher should stop at some point of doing research. He has to stop improving the review of literature. Very ambitious researchers always fall in the problem of circular writing. Sometimes, even after finishing a whole study, a researcher may come across a new reference that he finds interesting, but there should be an end to reviewing the literature. What we have said is about the content of the outline. Now let's look at the format of the outline. The outline of the literature review follows a conventional format. It's not any format in which a series of numbers and letters are used according to their level of importance. There are two aspects that should be considered when writing an outline. First, the spaces that we see, or the indentations. The indentations here are not the same, and this is meaningful. When indenting A and B here in the same way, this means that A and B have the same degree of importance in this outline. Both of them are the subheadings, or they develop one. We see in the figure that number 1, Arabic numeral, is not indented in the same way as A. This means that it belongs to another level. So 1 is part of A rather than 2. 1 develops A and helps it to develop 2. The same thing can be said about the subsequent headings and their level of importance. So spaces in an outline are meaningful. Just without reading the text itself of the outline, we can have an idea about the number of points under each main point. We said that a series of numbers and letters are used according to their level of importance. The most conventional way is to use Roman numerals with the main sections. These sections are divided using capital letters. And then in the next level involves the use of Arabic numerals. And the following level involves the use of small letters. Next, Arabic numerals inserted between parentheses. And finally, small letters inserted between parentheses. Notice that when we use the parentheses, the full stop is not employed. When writing an outline, the rules of punctuation have to be respected. Full stops usually follow the letters and numerals, except for the case of parentheses. Full stops are not used at the end of the headings when they are topical, and most of the time the outlines are topical or topic outlines. They are not sentence outlines. The first letter of the first word is usually capitalized. Also, capital letters should be used with content words in every heading. When I say content words, I mean lexical words. The grammatical words are not capitalized, like prepositions, short prepositions, articles, and conjunctions. Good outlining means good writing. After outlining, the last stage is writing the review of evidence. Here, this is drafting. One of the benefits of writing is that it is a tool to synthesize better and construct knowledge. We should not think that the researcher will first synthesize and then write. The researcher will synthesize and continue synthesizing through the tool of writing. For this reason, we say that writing is a way to construct knowledge, to build knowledge. In other words, a critical understanding of the materials comes with critical writing. When the researcher presents different views or different concepts and shows relationships between them, this is a way to criticize, and this is called critical writing. This will improve the understanding of the researcher. Sometimes researchers are stuck and they find themselves unable to write a word. The reason is related mainly to lack of reading. We can never write without reading. If you are stuck, stop, go to the literature again, collect more references, more materials, read them carefully, synthesize, then you will find it easy to continue writing. Researchers often ask about how much to write or the length of the literature review. This differs from one study to another, and it depends on the level and the research type, whether it's part of a thesis, a dissertation, or research article. The text which is produced by the researcher can range between a couple of pages to a couple of chapters. In the case of a dissertation, the review of literature will be divided into chapters, and sometimes it contains one chapter. A chapter has an introduction and a conclusion, only one introduction and one conclusion. In all cases, the researcher should learn how to write appropriate introductions, appropriate sections, subsections, and conclusions. They should also learn how to relate the review of literature itself to previous and following parts. In other words, coherence should be established within the text or the report. Another question that sometimes confuses the researchers is when or how is the review of literature divided? The divisions within the literature review are thematic. They are based on themes or topics. Whenever there is a new theme or a new topic, we expect to have a division. Of course, this is decided at the level of the outline. Problems happen when some sections contain many paragraphs. Some writers fail to divide the text appropriately into paragraphs. The product sometimes is very short paragraphs, those which contain 2 to 3 lines, or very long paragraphs, those which extend beyond 1 page. So researchers sometimes produce extremely short or extremely long paragraphs. Paragraph division is not random. We divide the text into paragraphs only when there is a shift to the discussion of a new idea. So for each new subtopic, and only in that case, a new paragraph is needed. Otherwise, the researcher will just continue on the same line. The paragraphs, although divided, they should be coherent. Coherence should be assured through creating the right transitions, and coherence can be achieved through the use of various tools such as cohesive devices, logical order, and meta-discourse. Meta-discourse includes phrases which are used by the researcher to direct the reader. For example, the researcher may write, as explained in chapter 1, and then continues discussing the idea. So this phrase, as explained in chapter 1, leads the reader to go to chapter 1. Sometimes the researcher writes between parentheses, see section X. Or he may write, to be discussed in part 2. All these are examples of meta-discourse. The role of meta-discourse is to lead the readers through the text, or to guide them. The review of literature should show the researcher's objectivity. How? The review of literature, the content of the review of literature doesn't come from the researcher's mind. It comes from other resources. The researcher should ensure that the presented information is faithfully transferred to the reader by giving credit to the original sources, that is to say, by citing the references. If the references are not cited, the researcher will fall in what is called plagiarism. Researchers are penalized for plagiarism.